Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to learn mostly about brushes. Actually, I'm going to take this in the second part of the tutorial. Take this picture of a sailboat, and we're going to actually we'll isolate the clouds and put some darker clouds in and kind of darken up the overall image. And then we're going to use something called the mixer brush to put kind of an oil painting effect on this particular picture. It'll look really cool in the end. In fact, it'll look a little bit like, if I click over, it'll look a little bit like this, which should be pretty neat. Before we do that, however, I'm just going to do a general quick tutorial on brushes. So to get started, I would like you to go to File, New, and pick 8.5 by 11, which is what's kind of preset here, just kind of a piece of paper basically. Background of white is fine, so if all that is set, go ahead and say OK. So here's our canvas, if you will. The first thing I want to do is actually create a gradient layer. So to do that, right now I have my foreground and background colors set on white. That's fine, but when you are going to set a gradient, it will automatically create a gradient within your options that based on your foreground and background colors. And I know that I want to make sort of a sky looking gradient, so let's make the foreground color. Double click on set foreground color, and let's pick kind of a sky-ish blue. I'm kind of maybe feeling right around there. That looks pretty good. My RGB is 2208 and 254, and I've got a hex code of 02D0 FC here if you want to exactly duplicate that. Otherwise, any sky blue is going to be just fine. And I'm actually going to create a fill layer here. So go to Layer, New Fill Layer, and choose, instead of solid color or pattern, choose Gradient. And there's Gradient Fill Layer 1. And this looks good, except the sky, I want to go from white to blue instead of blue to white. And if you look at this, you can do that pretty easily by changing the angle. So I can just actually rotate this tool around 180 degrees. And by the way, that would also be equivalent to -90 if you just want to set it. And that looks pretty good to me. That's a nice blue sky. Go ahead and say OK. So now we've put a gradient fill layer in. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to place my name, text name, Pete, if you remember from the text collage. So I'm going to go ahead and say File, Place. And there, I think that's the Pete. Yep, it sure is. And I'm just going to drag that kind of down here in the sky, just to have a point of reference, by the way. There's no really other reason for this. It doesn't need to be there, but just gives us something to look at and a place to actually put our brushes, which is what we're going to do next. There we go. Okay, so brushes. Brushes are a great tool, very commonly used in Photoshop. Maybe some of you have worked with them before. They are literally, you can, brush or place objects. You can do all kinds of different effects with brushes. They're a very versatile tool. And there's also, just like the styles that we showed before in fonts, there's many different brush packs and styles and creators of those things out there. So you can find a brush for just about any type of situation. You can find brushes for grunging up effects. You can find brushes for like gruesome blood spatter type effects. And you can also find them for things like clouds, which we're actually going to import a brush in a little bit for that. But first, I just want to show you under the Tools menu, if you go here to Brushes, that brings up the Brushes banner. And there's different settings that you can use in modes for brushes. We'll learn more about those in a minute. But in the drop down here, here is the brush selections. The size of the brush is obviously scalable. If I pick just a circular brush, this would be known as a hard selection brush. You can see that the hardness is set to 100%. What that means is that it's going to select. There's no kind of gradient or feathering around the edges. It's just going to select exactly the swath or path of 24 pixels. Softer brushes will kind of feather it around the edges, which is really an important tool when you're working with things like layer masks that are trying to get certain edges. There's also sort of different brush presets. This is would be almost like a paintbrush. This would be like for watercolors, watercolor buildup. This is a square charcoal pen. There's even ones for things like airbrushing. which is really cool. So you can imagine doing all kinds of effects. Let's say that you want to do like a city scene with some tagging on it. You could use the airbrush to do that effect. There's also lots of brushes that do sort of cloud and smoke effects that can simulate, well, obviously clouds and smokes, and that's important for lighting effects and for just about anything you want to do. So they're really, really flexible. What we're going to do today is I'm just going to do a couple quick brush effects to this particular picture. I'm going to put some grass here, and then I'm going to put some clouds up here. So to do that, first of all, brushes will often work in terms of picking up the colors that are in your foreground and background color. So I'm going to do the grass first. I'm going to pick a grass brush, and we're going to put some grass down here, kind of right with in line with peat. And so that'll be kind of the horizon. But to do that, I want to pick up a couple of greens. Grass has variant colors of green in it. So I'm going to pick up kind of maybe a little bit lighter grassy green for the foreground color. I'm going to double click on the background color. Maybe I'll go a little darker for that, a darker color green, so it gives it some richness and some variance. So I have a foreground and a background color, both of green, but two different shades, lighter and darker. And now, going to my brushes selection. So Tools, Brushes. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit and see some of my options, and there is a single blade of grass and a 3-blade grass. I'm going to click on that. You can see it defaults to 134 pixels. I don't know if that's good or bad, but the first thing I want to do is, when you're doing brush effects, you typically would not want to do that on layers that you've already created. So I have my background, which is white, I have my gradient layer, I have peat. I'm actually going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to call it brushes and say OK. And now I can do the work, lay it down on this layer. I also then, that's really important because I can delete it and remove it as I need if things don't work out the way I want. So my brush is currently 134 pixels, which I can see is not nearly big enough for this large canvas that I have. Plus also I put it in 300 dots per inch. So I'm going to turn this up a bit to, I don't know what the right size is, but I'm going to guess 500. And I'm just going to click here once, and you can see that it is laying down grass, right? It's still not big enough though, so I can bracket key up the grass. See how that works? That is way too big, 1600. That's crazy. 1400, maybe 900. How does 900? 900 is starting to look pretty reasonable. All right, so you can see I'm clicking, and also if you look closely as I'm clicking, it's doing different shades. You can see a lot of subtlety in the grass blades, which is pretty cool. So now if I want to lay down a lot of grass that's kind of thick, I can literally kind of click and drag, and you can see it sort of brings it in here. Little grass petals, or blades, excuse me. And there we go. So I've just laid down this grass. I'm going to thicken it up a little bit. I can certainly turn down or turn up, and what you want to do, because shouldn't all be a uniform size. So turn down and turn up the size a little bit, which is great to kind of fill in some other areas. But there we go. Now I have peat kind of sitting in the grass a little bit, if that makes sense. All right, the next thing I want to do is show you how to load a brush. There is kind of smoky effects that you can use to make clouds in the standard brush set. And as always, if I go to this gearbox here, there's all kinds of brushes that are preloaded with Adobe that you can just pull in. But you can also load them from many sources, and like everything else, I tend to go towards sources where you can buy and pay for the brushes that are a little bit more reputable, as opposed to just any old site that's saying you can download it for free. Anyway, let's go ahead and say load brushes. So I went to, just to make sure, the gear, load brushes, and then I had downloaded this earlier from the sandbox under my directory, and here's 5 Clouds Brushes ABR. Go ahead and say open. Now what happened is it usually appends it right to the bottom, and as you can see it is. So now I have these different clouds effects here, and we'll have to see which ones we want to work with, but maybe I'll just start with kind of a simple one and see how it See how it goes. Does this look pretty good maybe? Sure, why not? Alright, so you can see this is kind of a cloud effect. I want to, because I'm not sure if this is probably going to default to pick up the white, but I'm not quite sure. So I'm going to just change my foreground and background colors here. Maybe I'll just go a little bit more gray there, just a slightly less tone. And let's see what this does for me when I click on it once there. It's a nice, beautiful cloud, right? And then I can scale this up a little bit, because they wouldn't be very uniform, obviously. And if I want to change the brush a little bit and try a different style, like here's this one. This is kind of more wispy clouds, which I like too. That's great. So you can see it's just lightly putting in clouds in the sky. That looks wonderful, and that's one of the real strengths of brushes. They just do a great job. So we've learned how to load brushes, apply them. You'll work with brushes a lot. And then the next thing I want to do is actually use something called the mixer brush, and I'll show you how that works. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over on my tabs to my sailboat picture. Again, at the beginning of this tutorial, wanted to go to the sandbox. I got SP01 sailboat picture JPEG. It's a beautiful picture of a sailboat on the water. Fairly nice day, a little bit of clouds in the sky. What we're going to do to this is actually use something called a mixer brush to create an oil painting effect. There's a lot of uses for the mixer brush, by the way. This is just one that will give you good practice in terms of how to apply the technique. It's also a very popular technique, in fact, between I think CS5 and CS6. In CS6 they added oil painting as an actual filter effect that you can do. I don't think it turns out as nicely in a lot of cases as when you brush it yourself, but you can actually do this as an effect. But for the purpose of working with mixer brushes, learning how it works, this is a really great activity, and it's fun because it turns out pretty darn cool. What we'll end up creating eventually is we're going to replace this sky with the more stormy weather. We're going to curve down the light intensity a little bit to match the storm, and then we are going to apply the mixer brush and turn it into or convert it into an oil painting. And when it's done, it's probably going to look a little bit like this, which is pretty neat, right? Okay, so the first thing I want to do, these are skills that you've already learned. I'm going to go ahead and take the background layer and convert that to an editable layer. I'll just call it sailboat pick and say okay. And I want to isolate the clouds, and so I'm going to go ahead and do the quick select tool, and actually this is a really easy selection. All I got to do is grab all the clouds, and see I've got it all here, right? And now I'm ready to, actually I could just remove the layer. It doesn't matter if I destructively remove this particular layer, because we're going to be replacing it with darker clouds. So if I just click delete, I've just removed it. Now we know that if we zoom in here, that there's still going to be some detail left in the between the sky and you can see it there. You see there's some blue in here yet. We probably would want to spend a little bit of time cleaning that up. You can see the blue here, because it may stand out quite a bit between when we put a darker background in it. So I'm going to actually change the view to overlay, and yeah, it looks like I should be able to see that pretty well. And I'm just going to refine the edge a little bit here. So I'll start from the right hand side. Maybe I'll just, doesn't have to be super perfect, so I'll make this a little big. And let's just see if we can just pull some of that out just by kind of following the edge here. And it looks like it pulled out some of that blue. I can see that this is kind of working okay, so we'll keep doing that. Yeah, it looks good. It may not be perfect, and it doesn't have to be. But I'll go ahead and do this quick. You do the same, and then we'll be right back ready to place the stormy skies. Alright, so I've refined my edge. I'm just going to say okay to this, and you know, it looks pretty good. I think it'll be fine for this. The next thing I want to do then is go ahead and say File, Place, and I'm going to pull in the stormy clouds picture that we downloaded from the sandbox. That's SPO2 storm clouds. Go ahead and say place. And that is placing it kind of over this image. Let's just move it down so it's in line with the image, and go ahead and check off to place. Now, when we move the layers, because right now we've got the storm clouds over the sailboat picture, we actually want to go opposite. And you can see that looks pretty decent, right? So now we've got kind of more ominous dark clouds. And I think that is pretty cool. The only thing that I would say is the brightness, the lighting is a little off here compared to the darkness of the clouds. So to deal with that, we know that we can do a curve adjustment layer. And remember, that's the half circle here. And if I scroll down and choose curves, I can just darken up this a little bit by bending it down. We were bending up before to create that spotlight effect, but we can bend down and just make it a little darker, a little more ominous looking, and I sort of like that right about there. Just a slight curve to make it a little darker, and that looks great. So now we're ready to start using the mixer brush on this particular image, but the first thing I want to do actually is flatten it out. I want to just merge all this stuff together and make this my picture. So to do that, go to Layers, merge all the visible layers, and it just did it. We're going to go ahead and use something called the Mixer Brush tool. So the Mixer Brush tool is really interesting. It's a very useful tool, and it sort of more realistically simulates actual painting if you were using brushes and doing it on a canvas. So it allows you to make adjustments and kind of sample colors from the image and blend them, and then also it allows you to control how much the wetness of the brush, the dryness of the brush, and how much color you're actually picking up, which is called the load, and it's a pretty cool feature. So let's go ahead and look at that. So in the brushes tool is actually underneath it. So if I click and hold for a second, you can see the brush tool, pencil, color replacement. Here is the Mixer Brush tool. Go ahead and select that, and you can see there's a whole bunch of settings here. The type of brush you want to choose, like there's fine brushes and there's bristle brushes, and you know what you want to use is going to flare fan high bristle brush count is what I had here, so that would spread out to quite a large area. This one is a round fan stiff thin bristles. You kind of have to experiment with these, and if you are an artist, you know more about this stuff than frankly I do. But what I'd like to do is I'll just start with this standard brush, the round fan stiff brush. I'm going to turn it up a little bit because I'm just thinking that I don't want to do too much, but we'll just try maybe 35 pixels for now in size. And then if you look across here, there's all kinds of settings, and I talked about before, you can customize how wet the brush is, how loaded it is up with paint, and then the mix or how much it blends colors. All these things are going to depend sort of how the overall effect ends up looking for your image, and in this case we're going to kind of go for sort of an oil painting look. So we'll just have to play with these settings a little bit. You'll have to play with them a little bit, and one of the great things about this tutorial is students that have sort of an eye for art really come up with some amazing looking stuff, especially compared to what I'm capable of doing, but I'm just here to teach you the skills. So one thing you do need though set here, once you've got your brush all set, I'm just going to go with these default settings, by the way, is sample all layers. You have to make sure that you are going to pick up the color from the original image layer. So like we do with all brushes, we're going to say layer new, and we're going to create I'll call it oil paint layer, and say okay. But if you do not have the sample all layers picked up, you won't have anything to brush. What you want it to do is actually pick up the colors from the picture, from the image. So why don't we do that now? So I've got the oil paint layer up, I've got it on sample all layers, and let's just see what this looks like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of zoom in a little bit, and so you can see this. And why don't we start in the clouds? And with my brush selected, if I just click and just click and drag a little bit and try to keep the same direction going, you can see how it's blurring the clouds. If I do it more, it's a bigger swoop, right? So I'm basically turning this into an oil painting. And then if I think, okay, that's a little bit too wet, I can turn it down. I can turn down the load or how much paint is in it, and it's going to be much more subtle. See how it's more subtle now? So it's not blending as much because it's not as wet a brush. And I've just kind of dried it out a little bit. Now you don't want to like get crazy and just start swooping it because it doesn't look right, right? So it's like little brush strokes, right? And the other thing you got to be careful about. See how I just picked up the tree there? That's not awesome. So you kind of just have to just be really careful with it. It's detailed, but it's so fun and it's really rewarding when you're all done. So I'm going to do one more part just to give you an idea of the detail. I'm going to focus just on the sailboat. And see the waves. I'm going to go ahead and just focus on the sailboat, and we're going to do that. And to do that though, I want a much smaller brush, and maybe not the bristly brush may not be all that good for that. So let's see, here's a low angle, low stiffness brush. Let's try that. And let's turn the pixels down to like 15-ish and even more. Like I'm going to go down to 7. Great. I think the wetness and the load will kind of keep those defaults. And now check this out. We can just kind of start blending this a little bit, and you can see I'm just kind of making it just a little. Oh, see, that was really bad. So let's go ahead and step that backwards a little bit. There we go. And start again. So you just got to be really careful and detailed with this, but it's really neat stuff. So you're just stylizing it a little bit. And if I just back out, you can see it kind of looks now more oil painting and abstract. Same with up here. So you're going to be doing this in your next assignment, and you'll just be playing with the effects a little bit and just work very carefully and in detail, and it's going to look really cool. In fact, the end it might look a little bit probably better than this, right? But that's really cool. We've taken that picture and we've converted it into almost an oil painting, a work of art. Thanks for watching.